Good morning, boys and girls. Do you remember last time when we finished our story, there was a young girl, maybe a few years older than yourselves, who was living in a pagan area. They bowed down to idols, and she'd had a Bible given to her, and she'd read it. And in the Bible, she'd learned that God doesn't like us bowing down to idols. In fact, God says, do not bow down to any other God but me. Can anyone remember her name? It was a very unusual name. I'd be very impressed if anyone gets this. It's a difficult one. It came in 3 parts. No. So her name was Jewel of Victory. So over there it's a bit more of a common name, but in the UK we probably wouldn't call anyone that. Now, Jewel, when she'd realized that she wasn't meant to be bowing down to idols, she wasn't meant to be worshipping foreign gods, she'd become a Christian. She'd asked God for forgiveness for the wrong things that she'd done, and God forgave her for her sins, something that the false gods that she'd been praying to for years were not able to do. They couldn't forgive her, that they couldn't even hear her. They were just pieces of wood and pieces of stone that people had shaped to look like idols. But this caused Jewel a problem. You see, her family were still idol worshippers, and they didn't want to stay, or they didn't want Jewel to be worshipping another god. So she had to face a choice, either stay as an idol worshipper or leave. So she left, and she went to Amy Carmichael's home for children a few miles away in a different area of Donavar. The locals weren't very happy when they heard about this. They weren't happy that one of their family members had gone over to another religion. And so that night, once they realized that Jewel had left, they all grabbed torches. That was their light source back in the day. And they marched off over to Amy Carmichael's home, where Amy had about 30 children at this point, all living there. They marched through the night and they surrounded Amy's home, and they demanded the return of Jewel. They said, give us Jewel back. She belongs to us, and she belongs to the God that we worship, which was a false god. Amy was in trouble here. She lived in a wooden house. She was one woman with 30 or so children, and she had an angry mob surrounding her, threatening to burn the place down if they didn't return Jewel. And Amy thought, well, what can I do here? If I give Jewel back, I'm not protecting Jewel, that's dishonoring to God. If I keep Jewel here, we might all die. But Amy noticed, as the crowd kind of threatened and shouted and jostled each other, no one was coming forward to make the first move. No one was taking the step of either torching her house, that's burning it down, or of seizing Jewel and dragging her back. And Amy realized there was a dilemma for the angry mob. You see, this was British India. It was ruled at the time by the British state. Amy was Irish. At the time, Ireland was part of Britain, which meant she was a British citizen. And the mob knew that if they touched a British citizen, they would have British troops descend on their area. And the rule from Britain was quite simple. You leave our citizens alone, we'll leave you alone. If you harm our citizens, we'll harm you. And so eventually the mob began to disperse. They realized that Amy wasn't going to give in. And the whole time that this was going on, Amy was praying to God, asking for his safety, and God protected her. And by morning, the angry mob had dispersed. They weren't happy. They said they wouldn't forget this, but they had gone home. Well, Amy had learnt to trust God at a young age. When she was in Ireland, she'd been raising money for disadvantaged girls. That's girls who worked in mill houses. They didn't have very good clothes. They didn't have much food. And so she would go around trying to collect money for them to build what we call welcome halls nowadays. That's sort of churches for them to meet at, because mill workers wouldn't be allowed to go into fancy churches where you had to dress smartly. And one day Amy had gone to a big fancy mansion. She'd seen that a mansion had been built by a rich man, and she thought, well, surely if he's had the money to build his fancy house, he can spare a little bit of money to help build a welcome hall for the girls who don't have much for themselves. So she knocked on his door, she showed him the card that explained what she was trying to do, and he said, "Go away, I will not give you any money. Those people can look after themselves. I won't help." And Amy couldn't understand why this man wouldn't assist people who were less fortunate than him. So she turned to God. She'd prayed and prayed for money. Even though she was a young child, she prayed for money to build a welcome hall. And God actually provided. She got given 2 separate checks for about £500, which let her and her family build an iron frame structure called a welcome hall. And when she was in India, as an older lady, Amy was teaching this to the children. She was teaching them, if you pray to God, when you have a real need, pray to God, ask for his daily provision, God will provide. And by this point, about 42 more children had come to her, so she had a big need. She needed food, she needed clothes, she needed toys for the children, she needed a lot of money to build more huts so that everyone could have a place to sleep, a place to pray, somewhere they could play, cook their food as well. And so each day they would collect the mail that came in. People would write to Amy, they would write to the children all over the world. People were hearing about what Amy was doing. And sometimes in those letters, there wouldn't just be words of encouragement, there would be gifts. And so the children would open up their envelopes and they would check each envelope for money. And Amy needed £100, or about £6,000 in today's money, to build more shelters for all these new children. And when they were going through all the letters, they'd prayed for money. Amy hadn't got any money from the letters. The last one, which came from a missionary society, says there's £66 on the way. So they still needed 34 in the money of their day. And then they had a big parcel. And when they opened the parcel, they found that people all over the world, children about their age, had been saving up their money for sweets. And instead of buying sweets, they were sending it to Amy. There was an elderly couple who were about 84 years old, had kept these gold coins for years and years and years, never used them. They sent them to Amy. There were people in Manchester who were knitting baby clothes, and they were sending those to Amy and the orphanage. And there was a young girl, even in the US, who, instead of buying a doll for herself, sent 6 penny coins over to Amy. Amy was grateful for this because she knew God saw their need in India and was prompting people all over the world to give generously to the orphanage that Amy was running. Well, then they began to pray about another need that they had. So they had houses, they had a place to keep the children, but one thing they really wanted to do was be able to travel out to remote regions when they heard that there was a young girl particularly in trouble in a temple who was being forced to do terrible things as service to these gods. They could drive out and rescue the girl. The issue was there was no way to get easily to other remote parts of India in those days. And someone said, well, why don't you just go and buy one of these newfangled motor vehicles, what we would call a car today? And Amy thought about it, she prayed with her friends, and she didn't want to do it. It would be very, very expensive, about £10,000 in today's money, or 160 in the old money that they were using. And so Amy prayed. She said, Lord, if you want me to get a car, show me. And so the Lord did. One day, Amy was going to a hospital in a distant region to see a sick young girl who needed help. And on the way back from the hospital, Amy had to get 3 caravans. That's a little cart with wheels, a very bumpy thing. She had to get 2 buses, and then the 2 final people who were bringing her back charged her 3 times the amount because she knew she was ill. And this was the sort of thing she had to travel in. Very impressive bit of engineering for what it does, but you wouldn't want to ride several hundred miles on it. It's very slow. It can go anywhere it wants because it only has 2 wheels. But this was what Amy was faced with, and she thought, okay, yes, maybe God does want me to get a car. And when she got back from the awful trip, they checked the finances. They just about had enough, so they got one, and they started building new shelters so they could get the kids. And Amy prayed. She thought, I'm not sure I should have got this car. God, if you really wanted me to have one, give me a sign. And a few weeks later, she actually did get a check from a missionary society which said, here's £160 for a car. So she knew that God wanted her to have these things. The moral of the story, children, is God wants us to ask him for things. He is our provider. He cares when we have needs. He creates those needs. And when we go to him daily and ask him for our daily bread, for food, water, a nice place to live, shelter, roof over our heads, we should ask him for good health, for protection for ourselves, for our friends and our family. If we ask God for these things, it pleases him, and he is gracious to give us the things that we need. And next week we'll